So on a lighter note, driving back from Minneapolis, Minnesota, the day after having visited our son Kyle this past Christmas, Trina and I stopped for a bite to eat at a Culver's restaurant outside of Toma. And as Trina took our 14-year-old Papillon, some of you have met our dog, took her out for a brief walk, I went in and ordered the food, and I hunted in my pocket for the correct change. But then when the total for our meal appeared on the register's screen, I did something of a double take. "Shouldn't it be more than that?" I asked the counter clerk. "No," she replied. "The price reflects your 5% senior discount." "You are a senior, aren't you?" "Well, it depends," I said. "What's Culver's policy with regard to senior discounts?" "You just have to be 60 years old," she said. "Well, I guess I'm a senior then," I replied, and I put the extra coins back into my pocket. Seniority has its privileges, as this episode attests, at least in certain establishments and on certain occasions. But the opposite is also true. Youth are often advantaged over their elders in the job market. Age works against, as we know, the 50-something man or woman who has been downsized from their job. More often than not, employers these days prefer younger folk, even when their skill set is no better than that of their more seasoned competitors. Privilege. It operates at many levels and under many different guises. You've all heard the expression, "He was born on third base and thought he had hit a triple." There are privileges acquired at birth by virtue of one's social or economic standing. In some traditional cultures, primogeniture still affects a child's future. If you are lucky enough to be the firstborn, and particularly if you were the firstborn son, you enjoyed a long leg up on your siblings. People born into wealth or status have automatic advantages that others lack. Despite a mediocre academic record, they may gain access to an Ivy League education via what we call a legacy admission. Think George W. Bush. More often than not, wealthy individuals benefited from generous inheritances from their parents or their grandparents. Think Donald Trump or David Koch. On the other hand, what Michael Harrington observed more than 50 years ago remains very true today. What Harrington said was that most people who are poor because they made the mistake of being born to the wrong parents. Privilege also comes into play with respect to the opportunities available to men and women in our society, and we're a long way from Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Although many professions once closed to women, like the ministry, medicine, law, military and commercial aviation, engineering, although many of these professions have opened up, men still generally have an advantage over equally talented women. So take the field of engineering. Women represent today about 17% of the total workforce in engineering, which is a higher percentage than it was 20 years ago. But a recent longitudinal study of 5,300 women engineers found that 40% of those who had earned their engineering degrees either never entered the profession at all or they abandoned it after just a few years. And fully a third of those who had quit cited incivility and lack of support from their male supervisors and co-workers. And another 50% mentioned poor working conditions, low salary, and lack of advancement opportunities. As Alan Johnson has pointed out, most men can assume that their gender will not be used to determine whether they'll fit in at work, whether teammates will feel comfortable working with them. And of course, unearned privilege still adheres to those who are heterosexual to the detriment of folks who are gay, lesbian, bi, or transsexual. It gives those who are able-bodied significant advantages over those individuals who have disabilities. But in our country, all forms of privilege, all expressions of privilege, pale before a pervasive one that continues to have a profound impact on men and women alike, rich and poor, gay and straight. And this privilege, of course, is skin privilege, whose advantages are linked to nothing more than the lightness of one's complexion. And so that being the case, I would like to devote the remainder of this morning's discourse to this controversial and frequently misunderstood phenomena of white privilege. Now, what do we mean by privilege? Peggy McIntosh offers us this simple definition. Privilege exists when one group has something of value that is denied to others simply because of the group they belong to, rather than because of anything they have done or failed to do as an individual. McIntosh goes on, my privileged status does not determine the outcome, but it is definitely an asset that makes it more likely that whatever talent, ability, or aspirations I have will result in something advantageous for me. Now, to be sure, when it is suggested that they enjoy certain advantages on account of their skin color, any number of white people will disagree. They will automatically become defensive, saying, you say I'm privileged, but I don't feel privileged. My life is difficult. It's anxious. It's demanding. How can I be privileged and not be positive, feel positive about my situation? How can I be privileged if my expectations remain unmet? And so since there seems to be this disconnect between the premise of white privilege and the individual's lived experience, then the former, privilege, is held to be invalid. But here's the thing. Any one of us can be highly stressed by the demands of parenthood. We can be displeased about our job. We can feel financially pinched. We can have physical or medical concerns. And any one of the above factors can affect our sense of well-being. But which one of us could say that a white skin lowers our life satisfaction? How many of us could identify with child advocate Marian Wright Edelman's observation that if you are black, physically, mentally, and emotionally, there is no respite ever from your badge of color? White privilege has little, if anything, to do with any particular individual's level of achievement. What we are faced with here is a social construct that is superimposed on our personal lives and about which we have little, if anything, to say. White privilege just goes with the territory. To be born white is to be born bearing that invisible knapsack of unmerited advantage. Now, as the heirs to certain Enlightenment values, values that stress conscious, rational thought and individualism, as heirs to these values, we may have difficulty recognizing and accepting the role that white privilege plays in our lives, because we do not intend to take advantage of people of color, because we do not indulge in prejudicial behavior, because we believe in fairness, equity, and interracial harmony. How can we possibly be implicated in this injustice? But the fact is, most of the privileges that white Americans enjoy and that we profit from are not the result of deliberate personal choices that we have made. As John A. Powell points out in his book, Racing to Justice, virtually all sectors of society now renounce racism. Maybe less true after those occurrences in McKinney, Texas, that we were all witness to recently. But virtually all sectors of our economy and our society now do renounce racism. The good American, Powell says, refuses to engage in conscious racially motivated behavior, refuses to see race, refuses to call it out. Americans today believe that they are race blind. But white Americans need not seek white privilege. We simply exist within it. For its beneficiaries, often as not, white privilege operates below the level of consciousness, something that day by day we never really have to think about. And then, too, there is that other matter of the individualist ethos, the way that it affects our estimation of other people. As members of the dominant white culture, we have taught to believe that people, no matter what their color, that people succeed or fail by virtue of their own individual efforts. Faced with certain barriers, the enterprising individual should overcome them, pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, And to suppose that someone might enjoy a significant head start based solely on skin color is to call into question, radically so, that quintessential American myth of the self-made man or the self-made woman. So let's take a little bit closer look at how this white privilege business plays out in our society. In an op-ed piece that was published last winter, New York Times columnist Charles Blow described a scary episode that took place the day after Christmas in Chattanooga, Tennessee. There was this individual. They were clothed in body armor, and they were cruising through a neighborhood in a dark-colored sedan, firing a pistol out the car's window at other vehicles. Police were alerted, and after a high-speed chase, the report puts it, the shooter was taken into custody without incident and without injury. So far, so good. As it turns out, the shooter was a 45-year-old white woman. Blow invites us to compare this episode with recent well-publicized encounters involving young black men and law enforcement officers. He says it is hard to read stories like this one from Chattanooga and not believe that there is a double standard in the use of force by police. It's a good thing, he continues, that officers took this woman in without incident or injury. But can one imagine the result being universally the case if the shooter happened to have looked different? Would this episode have ended this way if the shooter had been male, or black, or both? People of color, particularly African American men, have been caught up in this twister of macro and micro aggressions. And no amount of ignoring can alleviate it, and no amount of achieving can ameliorate it. The American mind, he says, has been poisoned from this country's birth against its minority populations. American law enforcement has been on the defensive in recent months. Their actions toward African Americans harshly criticized and just as strenuously defended. But the inequities of our criminal justice system, those inequities are profound. America's prisons are crowded with young black men, the vast majority of whom were imprisoned for simple drug possession. Indeed, black youth are nearly 50 times as likely as white youth to be incarcerated for a first-time drug offense, even though whites comprise nearly 70% of all illegal drug users. Anti-racism trainer Tim Wise describes his years as an undergraduate at Tulane University in New Orleans, the loud house parties thrown by his fellow white students, the alcohol that flowed freely, the air that reeked with marijuana. If the police appeared at the dorms, it was only to caution the students about making too much noise. No one was ever arrested for serving alcohol to underage drinkers or for casual drug use. Wise observes that the same permissiveness prevails at Grateful Dead concerts, whose fans are overwhelmingly white. But the disparate treatment of whites and persons of color by the justice system, that represents only one piece of the privilege problem. So let me highlight just a couple of others. Today in America, the average African American student attends a school that is at least 50% black, and that is almost always understaffed and underfunded relative to schools in the same area that are predominantly white. In the United States, black job applicants without a criminal record have about the same chance of being hired as white applicants with a criminal record. Blacks with college degrees have greater difficulty finding jobs in their field than white college graduates. For example, on a proportional basis, technology companies hire qualified African Americans at half the rate of their white counterparts. Whites are more likely than blacks to have loan applications approved, and during the recent housing bubble, were far less likely to be offered subprime mortgages. Indeed, in private memos, Wells Fargo's loan officers referred to those subprime mortgages as ghetto loans. The average net worth of white families in the United States today is 13 times that of black families, due in large part to imbalances in home equity, an outcome directly attributable to exclusionary practices by banks, by real estate agents, and ultimately by the Federal Housing Administration. The enduring chasm of race is still with us, former UW-Madison historian Timothy Tyson writes. In some ways it is wider than ever. Blacks fall behind whites in almost every observable measure of well-being, including health, mortality, wages, and crime victimization. These are tangible, quantifiable differences. But there are also a whole bunch of intangibles, telling anecdotes from black patrons about being shadowed in department stores, ignored in restaurants, or being asked to supply additional identification in order to use a credit card or to cash a check. Or consider this story as related by the journalist Ellis Coase. There was an African-American attorney. He was a partner in a large urban law firm. He went to the office early on a Saturday morning to catch up on some work. He was standing near the elevator and was confronted by a recently hired young white attorney from the same firm. The white man asked the older black man, "Can I help you?" Partner shook his head and tried to enter the elevator. The white man stepped into his way and repeated his question, this time as a direct challenge. "Can I help you?" And only then did the partner reveal his identity, at which point, without apology, the young attorney moved aside and allowed him to enter the elevator. Coase says, the young white man had no reason to assume the right to control the older man who was standing before him, except the reason provided by the cultural assumption of white racial dominance that can override any class advantage that a person of color might have. So this then gives you a little idea about how white privilege tilts the playing field, leaving people of color with this uphill climb in their quest for equity. Now, are some African Americans successful? Absolutely. The Obamas are the most notable example of this. But as the black journalist Ta-Nehisi Coates complained last June in The Atlantic, Barack and Michelle Obama, they've won the game. But they've won by being twice as good and by enduring twice as much. Now, with respect to the genesis of white privilege, the historical record explains a whole lot. 300 years of slavery aside, consider the legacy of Jim Crow, a more recent legacy. Public policy deprived African Americans of free land under the Homestead Act, exclusion of blacks from most labor and trade unions, restrictive real estate covenants, local sundown ordinances that drove African Americans off their property in states like Wisconsin and Illinois, out of their livelihoods and into the inner cities. The decimation brought about by deindustrialization and urban renewal in the large cities. A GI Bill that, as Ira Katzelnoff describes it, represented an affirmative action program for white men. The exemption of African Americans from key provisions of the New Deal. And when you take all of the foregoing into account, it's not hard to reach the conclusion that white Americans and Americans of color have lived and continue to live in a society separate and still dramatically unequal. And this is not about anything that any one of us as individuals did. And therefore, it is not a reason for guilt-tripping ourselves. It is, however, a call for brutal honesty. White privilege is something that we as persons of integrity need to acknowledge and that we need to take responsibility for. And what does responsibility call for? Continuing education, for one thing. There is so much more to this story than I've been able to share briefly in 25 minutes. And you can become an ally, which means really listening to people of color and giving credence to what they have to say about their own lived experience. And then finally, we can become more consistent and more intentional about living out our values. We cannot simply slough off the privileges that the dominant culture has bestowed upon us. But we can do what we can in order to ensure that others are not denied the unearned entitlements that we have all enjoyed as a birthright. Over the decades, we've seen any number of positive developments in American race relations. But in certain key respects, the more things change, the more they seem to stay the same. And yet, as James Baldwin declared many decades ago, if we do not falter, we may be able, handful that we are, to end this racial nightmare, to achieve our country, and to change the history of the world. May it be so. And so now